Chapter 9 The Three-Storied Factory. I had intended to ask Ouspensky more about the two contrary movements occurring in the ray of creation, that is to say, about the descending octave by which denser and denser matters were being formed, and about the other ascending movement which might in time lead to the moon becoming more like the earth and the earth more like the sun. But my question could not be put, for at the beginning of the next meeting Ouspensky announced that, having given examples of the action of the two great cosmic laws working on an immense scale, he now proposed to show their working on the much smaller scale of man. Man, he reminded us, was a model of the universe, a microcosm in macrocosm, and many statements which applied to the universe applied also to him. Moreover, a large range of the matters or hydrogens found in the ray of creation were to be found in man. His being contained matters from the level of the sun and even from a still higher level, and his possession of such high hydrogens was one of the factors which made it possible for him to evolve. Ouspensky said that so far we had been studying the creation and maintenance of the universe, but that the time had come for a similar study of the maintenance of man. Man, Ouspensky said, expended a large amount of energy every day in living, and this energy was derived from his food. According to the system, he took in not one but three kinds of food: the ordinary food he put into the mouth, the air he drew into his lungs, and the impressions he received by way of his special sense organs. It was quite easy to accept the idea that air was a food on which he was even more dependent than he was on the food he chewed and swallowed, but the idea that our sense impressions were also food would be strange to us. Yet the impressions reaching us from the outer world were all parcels of energy, whether we took them in the form of light waves impinging on our retinas, as sound waves reaching us through our ears, or as heat rays striking our skin. Moreover, as he had already pointed out to us, it was these impressions from the external world which activated us and set us in motion in the same way that the driving belt set in motion the lathes in an engineering workshop. If all the impressions from the outer world were to cease, and there were others besides light, heat, and sound waves, we should plunge straight into a coma and rapidly die. Of the three varieties of food, impressions were, by far, the most important to us, and we were able to survive the loss of them only for a very short time. Ouspensky then drew on the blackboard a new diagram, which he said represented man as a three-storied chemical factory. The work of this factory was to convert coarser matters into finer matters, the coarser matters being the raw material we took in as food, and the finer matters being the various materials we required for the maintenance of our machinery and for the fuel consuming in running it. Ouspensky said that one of the reasons why we were unable to remember ourselves and why the higher centers in us did not function was that we possessed insufficient of the finer fuels. Hydrogen 12 was needed by both emotional and higher emotional centers, and we were invariably short of this high octave spirit, so that emotional center in us usually had to work with hydrogen 24. There were two ways of obviating this shortage: first, by ceasing to waste hydrogen on useless projects, and second, by producing more of it. It was about the manufacture of finer hydrogens that we now wanted to speak. Ouspensky started his description of the work of the factory by saying that the alchemical processes by which the grosser materials were transformed into finer ones were governed, as all other processes were governed, by the law of octaves. He explained that he used the term alchemical instead of the more usual term chemical because what he was about to describe was more closely connected with the ancient science of alchemy than with the modern science of chemistry. The words "learn to separate the fine from the coarse" were inscribed on the emerald tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, and we should find that these words were appropriate to the working of the three-storied factory. The upper floor of the factory corresponded roughly with the head, the middle floor with the chest, and the lowermost with the stomach, back and lower part of the body. The ordinary physical food we took in by mouth was, H768 in the cosmic scale of hydrogens, which he had previously given us, and, after being swallowed, this coarse material entered the lowermost story or abdomen as DO 768. Because it was acting here as the conductor of the passive force of a triad, it would not be called hydrogen 768, but oxygen 768. After entering the body, it met carbon 192, saliva, and its contained ferments, and was transformed quickly into nitrogen 384. See figure 4. Uspensky now pointed out that the three substances oxygen 768, carbon 192, and nitrogen 384, shown in the diagram, formed a triad, and that in following the progress of the three foods through the three-storied factory, we had excellent examples of the way in which the two fundamental cosmic laws, the law of 3 and the law of 7, work together. The diagram which Uspensky drew on the board, and which showed the working of the two fundamental laws within the human body, was an extremely complicated one, and it is not proposed to reproduce it here. In order to keep things simpler, only the first triads in the series of triads have been given in figure 4. In figures 5 and 6, the transformation of coarser into finer hydrogens is shown only as an ascending octave, the triads not being marked. Returning to the octave of the food taken in by the mouth, DO 768 is converted, with the help of certain digestive juices, first into Re 384 and then into Me 192. See figure 5. Here the process of refining would come to an end were it not for the fact that the food octave received the help of another octave in filling the interval Mi Fa. The octave which provides this required help is the second or air octave. This enters the three-storied factory on the second floor, meets the food octave there, and imparts to it some of its superfluous energy, so that Mi 192 passes to Fa 96, Sol 48, La 24, and Si 12. So here's figure 4. The first two triads in the octave of digestion of food, H768, carbon, the bearer of the active force in these triads, is represented by the shaded circles. I'm going to briefly explain figure 4. So it has the three levels: the top head, here there is an entrance, food by mouth, the middle chest, and the bottom back and abdomen. In the middle floor we have nitrogen, Me 192, carbon 96. Those two are linked together in a parallel manner, and then they go down to the bottom floor, back and abdomen, and the carbon and the nitrogen both interact with nitrogen 0 and Re 384. You also have oxygen in this bottom floor, DO 768, connecting with carbon 192. That oxygen and carbon on the bottom floor are both connected with each other as well as with nitrogen. And one last thing, there's an entrance, again, food by mouth on the top floor in the head, and this goes directly down to the oxygen. This links directly down with the oxygen on the bottom floor in the back and abdomen with the oxygen of DO 768. And back to the text. Here it comes to an end in front of the C-Do interval. We now follow the progress of the second or air octave, and we find that DO 192 is converted into Re 96 and Mi 48. Because it receives no outside help at the interval between Mi and Fa, its progress is arrested here. The third, or impressions octave, comes to a stop even sooner. It sounds the note Do 48 in the uppermost or head story, but sounds it so feebly that it gets no further. And here we have figure 5. The three kinds of food, H768, H192, and H48. The conversion of H768 into higher hydrogens is assisted by the mechanical shock imparted by the entry of the air octave Do 192. This mechanical shock is represented by the wavy line. I'm going to really briefly explain this one. So top floor we have Do 48, Mi 48, Sol 48, and we have impressions, air, and food coming in this impressions coming in the top floor, air coming into that middle floor, food coming into that bottom floor. Um, in that middle floor, we have Do 192, Mi 192, Re 96, which links to Mi 48 from the top floor, Fa 96, which links with Sol 48 from the top floor, and La 24, which links with Sol 48 from the top floor. And in that bottom floor, we have Do 768, Re 384, which is linked to Do 768, and then we have C12, which is independent from Do 768 and Re 384, but is linked with La 24 from the middle floor. And back to the text. Having completed the drawing of the three-storied factory, Uspensky pointed out that the octave of the first kind of food was the only one to produce any of the much-needed H12, and that the two other octaves only managed to progress as far as Mi 48 and Do 48. If, therefore, we were to manufacture more H12, it would have to be through the air and impressions octaves going further. Fortunately, a more complete development of these octaves could be brought about by creating an artificial or conscious shock at the right place, that is to say, at the point at which the note Do 768 was being sounded. This point coincided in time with the moment at which impressions were about to enter our consciousness. And if the level of our consciousness were raised at that moment by self-remembering, the impressions would strike us with additional force. As a result, this Do 48 would sound much more loudly in the upper story, would pass first to Re 24 and then to Mi 12, where it would stop at the interval. See Figure 6. Because of the clearer sounding of Do 48, it possessed sufficient energy also to make contact with Mi 48, or the air octave, and to impart to it the additional force necessary for its passage to Fa 24, Sol 12, and even to La 6, which was the highest hydrogen the human factory was capable of making. Uspensky ended this description of the three-storied factory by saying that the production of higher hydrogens could be increased even further by the production of yet another conscious shock in the human organism. As the precise nature of this second artificial shock was more difficult to describe than the first conscious shock of self-remembering, he did not propose at the present moment to discuss it. The most important lesson to be drawn from the study of the food diagram was that we were very badly run chemical concerns, factories which succeeded in producing only just enough end products in the way of finer materials to keep the machinery running. It would indeed be more correct to admit that we did not even reach this low standard of production, for whereas emotional center ought to be provided with H12 for its fuel, it was usually forced to run on H24, the same fuel as that used by moving center. And the explanation of this sad state of affairs was that very large quantities of the finer products leaked out of holes or else were burnt up in useless activities, such as identifications, unnecessary talking, muscular tension, and negative emotions. A few minutes of indulgence in anger or despair was sufficient to destroy what it had taken the factory many hours to make, so that we felt completely depleted of energy. It would be highly unprofitable for us, Uspensky said, to make great efforts to increase the output of the finer products of the factory before we had taken steps to reduce so large an amount of wastage. And Figure 6, more complete transformation into higher hydrogens produced by the intervention of a second and conscious shock at the moment of entry of sensory impressions into consciousness. This is represented by the second wavy line. I'm going to briefly explain this one. So again, like the last diagram, we have the top floor with impressions entering into it, the middle floor with air entering into it, and the bottom floor with Do entering into it. Top floor, again, we have Do 48. So as he mentions, this is represented by the second wavy line. The second wavy line in this diagram is from, at that middle floor, Do 192 to Mi 192. The first wavy line is at Do 48 to Mi 48 in that top floor. This one is very complex, so I'm not even going to attempt to try and verbalize it, because I don't think it would make much sense. All right, back to the text. It would be highly unprofitable for us, Uspensky said, to make great efforts to increase the output of the finer products of the factory before we had taken steps to reduce so large an amount of wastage. Uspensky advised us to start this saving process by finding out what were our favorite methods of squandering energy. Sorry, I'm gonna reread this after the diagram, just to pull everything back together. The most important lesson to be drawn from the study of the food diagram was that we were very badly run chemical concerns. Factories which succeeded in producing only just enough end products in the way of finer materials to keep the machinery running. It would indeed be more correct to admit that we did not even reach this low standard of production, for whereas emotional center ought to be provided with H12 for its fuel, it was usually forced to run on H24, the same fuel as that used by moving center. And the explanation of this sad state of affairs was that very large quantities of the finer products leaked out of holes or else were burnt up in useless activities, such as identifications, unnecessary talking, muscular tension, and negative emotions. A few minutes of indulgence in anger or despair was sufficient to destroy what it had taken the factory many hours to make, so that we felt completely drained of energy. It would be highly unprofitable for us, Uspensky said, to make great efforts to increase the output of the finer products so that products of the factory before we had taken steps to reduce so large an amount of wastage. Uspensky advised us to start this saving process by finding out what were our favorite methods of squandering energy, for although we all resembled each other in being highly uneconomical concerns, we differed in our methods of dissipating energy, one person using up a great deal of energy, say, in unnecessary talking or daydreaming, another in inner considering, and yet a third in negative emotions. Our observations on this subject during the next few months yielded some very interesting results, and in time we discovered not only many of our leakages, but even experienced the sensation of energy pouring out of us at the time at which the wastage was occurring. The idea of useless expenditure of energy passed thus from the realm of theory into that of practice, so that it was no longer possible to doubt its truth. Uspensky said that the energy we manufactured today was for tomorrow's use, and he advised us, when tomorrow came, to keep some sort of rough account of the way in which we spent it. If we did so, we should find how improvident we were in our expenditure of this very valuable material. We resembled people with a shilling a day to live on, who wasted the whole of the shilling during the earlier hours of the morning on entirely unnecessary things, so that they had nothing on which to live the rest of the day. The higher hydrogens were the most valuable thing we possessed, required not only for ordinary living, but also for inner growth and development. Uspensky then reminded us of what he had previously said about the formation of the finer bodies in more evolved men, namely, that these bodies were made out of accumulated reserves of higher hydrogens. There was, he said, no possibility of any real change taking place in us unless we both saved and manufactured much more of these valuable substances. Uspensky was particularly interested in the writings of the old alchemists, who were popularly reputed to be engaged only in the study of methods of transforming the baser metals into gold, but this nominal work of theirs was often a screen for secret activities. In the Middle Ages, it was extremely dangerous for anyone to take an interest in systems of philosophy and psychology which were not countenanced by the all-powerful and sometimes tyrannical Church. Any suspicion that men were meddling with such pagan practices provided sufficient grounds for their immediate arrest and trial for heresy, and the occupation of transforming baser into finer metals provided thinkers with a convenient facade behind which to work. The interest of the best type of alchemist lay not so much in the changing of lead into gold as in the transformation of man into a new kind of man. Ouspensky said that it was likely that some of the alchemists were students of ideas very similar to those in which we were now interested. I wondered as I walked home from the meeting whether all this talk about the transformation of grosser substances into finer matters, and about the conversion of Do 48 in the impressions octave into Re 12 by means of a conscious shock, was of any practical value to me. So far as I was concerned, the chief interest of the diagram of man as a three-storied factory lay in the fact that it brought together and showed the relationship between two parts of man which had never before been combined in a single diagram, namely the physical food he took in by the mouth, and the psychological impressions he received through his sense organs. For the first time in my experience, two very incompatible pieces of man were being fitted together, his physiology and his psychology. This was, of course, the result of what had previously been done, namely, the substitution of a monistic for a dualistic philosophy. Was it justifiable, I wondered, to regard impressions as food? The idea was not unreasonable if by food was meant raw material which had to be taken in order to maintain life and growth. What Ouspensky had said about the vital need for impressions was probably true, and I recalled a reference in Michael Foster's Physiology to a boy with some nervous disease which had destroyed all tactile sensation, hearing, and the sight of one eye, a boy who immediately went to sleep when the other, seeing eye was closed. If what the system said was true, as to me it now seemed to be true, that messages from the outside world acted on us as a driving belt acts on a lathe, then it was quite logical to regard impressions as food. So also was it reasonable to suppose that the sounder we were asleep in the system's sense of that word, the fewer would be our impressions. Here, at any rate, was something which could be put to a practical test, and I did so by trying to self-remember as I walked the long length of Harley Street. After several tests of this kind, I was convinced that the impressions which I received at moments of self-remembering were both more numerous and more vivid than those received at other times. There were many messages from the outside world which never reached my consciousness prior to my efforts to self-remember, and this was particularly true of noises. When I started to self-remember, a whole world of sound came into being around me, a world which I had previously been almost completely blanketed. I immediately became aware of the rumble of traffic, of the sound of my footsteps, of the chatter of people as they passed me, of the shutting of doors and the distant hooting of cars. It was true that I also saw things which I had not previously noticed, but the change from not seeing to seeing was far less striking than was the change from not hearing to hearing. These experiments convinced me that what Ouspensky had said was true, and that a conscious effort made at the moment of receiving impressions greatly increased their vividness. There could be no doubt about it. If impressions were food, as it was now prepared to accept them as being, then, just as there were such things as good meat and bad meat, so must there also be impressions which were fit for human consumption, and impressions which were unfit for human consumption. And on what miserable impressions did some people, and particularly those people who lived in great cities, have to subsist? The impressions coming from gloomy alleys and from monotonous streets lined with melancholy houses, all slowly crumbling into decay, from gaunt blocks of offices which shut out the sky, and from factory chimneys billowing out smoke. Nowhere was there anything fresh from the hand of that sublime artist, Nature, nothing but the taw-dry and uninspired works of sleeping man. Yet drab through the impressions received from these industrial abominations might be, they were not necessarily poisonous to those who took them in, as some impressions undoubtedly were. I thought of the Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussaud's, of the canned delights of Hollywood and television, of the advertisements which faced one in the tube, and of the tragic headlines in the evening papers. What tainted stuff on which to nourish souls! And then the true significance of those words I must have uttered many times to patients became clear to me. What you need is a change of air. It was not a change of air, but a change of impressions that those poor starved patients needed. If samples of the Shoreditch air on which they lived were to be analyzed and compared with the air of Sandgate, to which they were going, little or no chemical difference would be found between them beyond, perhaps, a small preponderance of dust in the Shoreditch air. Nevertheless, a fortnight at Sandgate would be of immense benefit to the patient. When we remain too long in the same surroundings, the impressions we receive from them weaken and cease to nourish us. But if we are suddenly transported everywhere, say from Shoreditch to Sandgate, then we see everything new and gleaming. We drink in the sea, the cliffs in the sky. We hear the hoarse protests of the gulls as they swoop down over the harbor in search of an offal. We sniff tar and seaweed in the air, and, flooded with all these new and vivid impressions, we are revived. It was quite true, as a senior member of the group solemnly pointed out to me, that if we were less asleep, we should be able to extract all the nourishment we needed in the way of impressions by gazing at a blot of ink on a piece of blotting pad. But the fact was that we were not awake, and consequently we required the aid of periodic trips to places such as Sandgate. It was necessary to take our measure, and to realize how little we could manage to do, and highly unprofitable to have an exaggerated opinion of our capacities. Although nobody knowingly swallows bad food, but instead puts it aside, few of us see any need to reject bad impressions. Yet it is as important to protect ourselves from poisonous films, plays, books, and pictures as it is to protect ourselves from consuming rotten food. Sometimes we are unable to avoid coming into contact with bad impressions, but it is possible, with a little practice, to refuse to become identified with them and, as it were, to step aside from them. So also can something be done to take in much more fully the impressions we receive. As has already been said, the intensity of impressions is increased by self-remembering, and so also can they be strengthened by receiving them as a child receives them, on essence. At this moment I am looking at the bookcase in front of me, and I am receiving vivid impressions of bright colors coming from the covers, and particularly from a dust cover of royal blue, but immediately associative thought starts up in my mind in connection with this particular book, the name of the publisher, certain recollections of one of the directors of the film, a dozen other cheap and futile thoughts have captured my attention, and lo, the bright colors in my bookshelf have faded and then disappeared altogether. I see everything now, not as a young child would see it, but as a jaded adult, sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought, is condemned to see it. It is as though a London fog has invaded my room and drained everything of its freshness. The young child and the visionary alike see the world in pure naked color, unsullied by formatory centers, beiges, and dull grays. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the watches of the night. Yes, not only pure yellow and black, but yellow lighted from within. Aldous Huxley has pointed out that preternatural light and color are common to all visionary experience, and he illustrates this thesis with an extract from George Russell's Candle of Vision. The Irish poet writes of his own experience. I was sitting on the seashore, half listening to a friend arguing violently about something which bored me. Unconsciously to myself, I looked at a film of sand I had picked up on my hand, when I suddenly saw the exquisite beauty of every grain of it. Instead of being dull, I saw that each particle was made up on a perfect geometrical pattern, with sharp angles from each of which a brilliant shaft of light was reflected, while each tiny crystal shone like a rainbow. Then suddenly my consciousness was lighted up from within, and I saw in a vivid way how the whole universe was made up of particles of material which, no matter how dull and lifeless they might seem, were nevertheless filled with intense and vital beauty. For a second or two the whole world appeared as a blaze of glory. It works both ways. Pierced suddenly by a shaft of beauty, a man may be startled momentarily out of sleep, or conversely, by means of self-remembering, the outer world gains light and color. It is, in fresh and vivid hues, that an inspired artist often sees a commonplace object, and I no longer protest against the extravagances of modern school. of our modern school of painters. Their pictures are often infantile and crude, but they are struggling to portray what they have actually seen when freed from the dark glasses of associative thinking. Impressions from the outside world come to us dimmed and distorted by the obstructions they have encountered at the end of their journey. Something stands between them and us, and that something is a layer of fantasies and images in our minds. A layer which has to be pierced before the impressions can be registered by us. We deceive ourselves if we imagine that our minds are as open to impressions as the mind of a young child is always, for always there is this entangling layer of noises and distractions. Only in dreamless sleep does the sequence of disorderly utterances and mumblings in the area of the mind cease, so that the mind's whispering galleries are completely silent. This means that in our ordinary state we are never able to receive impressions in all their purity, but see things as people see them at dawn before the sun has had time to disperse the morning mists. If the doors of perception were cleansed, we should view things much more vividly and as they really are, or as Adam is supposed by Aldous Huxley to have seen them when on the morning of his creation he gazed at this miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. And if things were seen pure and uncontaminated with associative thoughts, what a resounding Do 48 impression would strike in the inner chambers of our minds, a note which would pass without any difficulty to Me 12. Of the reasons why this resounding Do 48 is so seldom struck in the West is our veritable fever for action, so that we are never willing to give ourselves up entirely to being, but instead are trying to do several things at the same time. We talk to ourselves or to somebody else as we are looking at a picture, and, when eating, we prop up a book on the table in order that we may read. Because of this desire for doing, our impressions seldom come to us pure and unsullied, but are usually jumbled and blurred. What we have to learn is not so much to do, but not to do, and Zen Buddhist books are full of admonitions about this need for being rather than doing. In the Supreme Doctrine, Hubert Benoit quotes the following conversation between a Zen Buddhist monk and his teacher. A monk: in order to work in the Tao, is there a special way? The Master: yes, there is one. A monk: which is it? The Master: when one is hungry he eats, when one is tired he sleeps. A monk: that is what everybody does. Is their way the same as yours? The Master: it is not the same. A monk: why not? The Master: when they eat, they do not only eat, they weave all sorts of imaginings. When they sleep, they give rein to 1,000 idle thoughts. That is why their way is not my way. Ouspensky and Gurdjieff taught a similar lesson, and much more of our time in the earlier stages of the work was devoted to trying not to do something we usually did than to endeavoring to do anything new. That Gurdjieff had methods in common with those of the Zen Buddhist teacher is confirmed also by the following story told me long ago by Maurice Nicole. Gurdjieff frequently made long journeys by car in France, stopping occasionally for refreshment in the open air, and Nicole sometimes accompanied him on these journeys. Once, very late on a beautiful starlit night, they pulled up for a much-needed meal in a grass patch by the side of the road, and Gurdjieff spread out the contents of the picnic basket on the running board of the car and invited Nicole to sit down and eat with him. He did so, but as he ate, he began to rhapsodize about the starlit dome over their heads. Gurdjieff took him very seriously to task. They were engaged, he said, in eating, and not in fabricating bad verse. There was a time for everything, and this was the moment for giving themselves up to the pleasures and impressions derived from eating.